Have you ever wondered what exactly rail gauge is and why people care so much about it? And, well, how do you wind up with messes like this dual gauge switch behind me sometimes? I'm Darren, and this is the Industrial Revolution. And before we start here, let's actually start with something a little bit smaller and easier to grasp. So this is a 7.5-inch gauge, or sometimes 7.25-inch gauge, and this is about the smallest railroad that you can actually ride on. I'm here at the Hesston Steam Museum today, and one of the great things about this museum is they actually have not one, not two, not three, but 4 separate rail gauges here. And at any given day, you can typically ride on at least 3 of them. So this one, at 7.5-inch gauge, you've probably seen these. They set them up in shopping malls, run around Santa's Village, for example. And it's tempting to think of these as just toys, but they have actually a pretty solid history behind them, especially getting railroad fans into bigger and better things. There's one guy you might have heard of. His name was Walt Disney, and he was a huge railroad fan. And this is the first size railroad that he set up in his backyard. His wife was pretty tolerant. These are commonly called garden railroads, garden in this case being the British form of backyard. You don't need much room for these. If you have a half acre or an acre in the back that you can set up a line, you can set up a pretty nice track. It's relatively inexpensive. You don't need a lot of rail bed preparation, and you can move stuff around pretty easily. So the rails, as you can see, are actually pretty standard. They're actually bolted together just like regular train rails. Instead of using railroad spikes, though, you actually just attach them with some basic wood screws to the ties. That gives you a good solid foundation to work from. And from there, you can set up your train. These trains are obviously pretty small. You're not going to find them pulling a couple hundred cars of iron ore or anything around. They're just for hobbyists, both to set up as a hobby, but also as experimental. For example, if you ever wanted to build a steam locomotive, this scale is a whole lot easier, a whole lot cheaper, and a whole lot safer to work with than anything larger than this. So the next scale that we have here at the Hesston Museum is the 14-inch gauge. 14-inch here, again, not production. You're not going to send this out on a logging route or anything like that. But these do date back quite a bit. This gauge actually goes back at least to the 1890s. And they were set up to give people rides around things like World's Fairs and festivals. Like the smaller gauge, they're still used quite a bit today, and they give people rides around amusement parks and zoos. So, good chance you've ridden this. The smaller one, you pretty much ride on top. This gauge, though, is actually big enough that you can put very small, very cramped cars on it, and people can ride inside of them. And people do it all the time. Looking at this, it's still obvious that this is kind of a excessively narrow gauge, and people question whether this is actually a real railroad. It is a real railroad. You can run real steam engines, you can run real diesel, real electric, but you're not going to do like heavy-duty production service. You're not going to do high-speed service or anything on that. To get up to that, we need to jump up to the next size. So our next two gauges here, and this is set up as dual gauge here at Hesston, is 2 and 3 foot gauge. These are both pretty standard narrow gauge lines. In fact, they're actually standard in metric as well. The 2 foot gauge is pretty much interchangeable with 600 millimeter, and the 3 foot gauge is also pretty much interchangeable with 900 millimeter. These gauges are standard. They're great for anything that doesn't require a lot of high speed and long distance. And we'll come to why that is here in a minute. The 2 foot is especially popular in things like mining, agriculture, industrial applications, carrying stuff around factories and things, where you don't really care about speed, but the train was basically used like you'd use a forklift today. The 3 foot gauge was used in all of those situations as well, and the 3 foot could actually handle a little more speed, and the reason for that, check out how fast can the steam locomotive go. The 2 foot and 3 foot had enough stability you could actually run standard passenger cars on them, or fairly standard. And looking at these cars, typically people don't know that they're not on a regular railroad. These could actually do production work. And today, 2 and 3 foot gauge are some of the most popular gauges to use in places like amusement parks and tourist railroads, heritage lines, that sort of thing. And there's some great reasons for that. But let's take a look at the actual rails themselves first before we jump to that. Okay, so here is some of that dual gauge I mentioned. And you see there's 3 rails. And the reason is you have this rail and that far rail. If you use those two, you're running a 3 foot gauge. If you run this rail and the center rail here, you're running 2 foot gauge. The gauge is actually defined, which is sort of weird, from the inside edge to the inside edge. It's not center to center, it's from the inside edge of the rail, and that's because that's where the flange will sit. So before the Civil War, rail gauges were all over the place in the US and really around much of the world. Just in the US alone, there were railroads running everything between 2 foot gauge, which is this extremely narrow gauge here, all the way up to a 6 foot gauge. Unfortunately, around the Civil War, the government realized this wasn't going to work. As they tried to move troops and equipment around the country to fight the war, they had to keep moving everything from train to train to train. They had to find new trains they could put on the tracks that'd run for 30 miles, and then they'd hit a different gauge and have to move to another train, and it was just a mess. The government decided this wasn't going to fly anymore, and they passed a new law. So finally in 1886, the standard gauge was finally enacted and pretty widespread around the country for most railroads. Standard gauge in the US and in much of the world is 4 foot 8.5 inches. If you're wondering why they came up with that bizarre number, it's because that's what was used throughout much of the Northeast United States at the time. And of course the North won the Civil War. The South, which was pretty heavily at 5 foot, they lost the Civil War, so the North didn't have to change their rail gauge so much and the South did. Today, almost all commercial railroads on basically main lines, freight lines, long distance passenger lines in the US, and again much of the world, are on that 4 foot 8.5 inch gauge. It's not universal. There are places in the US that still run narrow gauge for reasons. You know, they're on tight turns, also mining railroads, tourist railroads like the ones they operate here. Those are all exempt from standard gauge. They can run whatever they want. In other countries, Australia, for example, has 3 separate independent gauges. And there are actually places in Australia that not only run dual gauge like this, but you can actually find a little bit of triple gauge in some parts of Australia. Running dual gauge actually gives you an extra option. Did you notice that this locomotive is running a 3-foot gauge, but the cars are all 2-foot gauge? This is something which was really useful after the Civil War while they were working to convert all the rail lines, all the locomotives, and all the cars, but still needed to keep all the trains running during the transition. Here at the Hesston Steam Museum, with light trains and slow speeds, use a fairly simple coupler for this, allowing them to easily combine different locomotives and cars on the same train. But for railroads pulling heavier trains at higher speeds and longer distances during the rail gauge transition, they would sometimes set up some, if not all, of their equipment to easily move a standard knuckle coupler into 3 different positions, for standard gauge in the center and narrow gauge off to each side. So why do we have all these different gauges anyway? Well, the difference is what the train can actually do. So the smaller gauges, especially like the little tiny ones, they can't go very fast, they can't go very far, they can't carry much weight. Some of these little ones you can like push over with your hand. And that obviously isn't going to work. As you get bigger, the trains get more expensive, the trains get heavier, they get harder to work on, they get more dangerous to operate, but they can go a lot faster, they can carry a lot more. So bigger becomes advantageous. Up to a point. Why do we stop at standard gauge today at 4 foot 8.5 inches? Well, the reason we stopped there is because we basically had to pick something. There was a lot of infrastructure put in, to handle the 4 foot 8.5 up to maybe 5 foot gauge. And that includes a lot of bridges, tunnels, all the rail beds. And if you went wider than that, you could get a more stable surface to work from. You could have higher capacity. You'd have to build out the rail beds much more solidly. Brunel actually tried introducing a much wider rail gauge and ran a test railroad, which by all reports was very smooth, could handle ridiculous amounts of weight, and unlike almost everything else Brunel did, it never got adopted simply because it was going to cost too much to go back and change all the rail beds and the tunnels and the bridges and everything else. It just wasn't worth it. So we ended up standardizing at 4 foot 8.5 inches here in the States. Other places are 5 feet, for example. And once you've picked a standard and you've invested enough money in it, you're kind of stuck with it. But these rail gauges, which control everything you do on your train, these are the Industrial Revolution. Before you go, I do need your help. There's 2 things you can do. Number 1 is help YouTube get more people to the channel. Easiest way you can do that, completely free. Hit like on the video, subscribe to the channel, and best of all, you can comment more than just 2 or 3 words. That tells YouTube, this video is good, the channel's good, send more people here. Second thing you can do, each of these videos ends up being pretty expensive to actually produce. Obviously it's hours of work for each one, but I also have to actually drive to the locations. And if it's far enough away, I have to spend a night in order to do all the on-location filming that I do for these videos that I think is essential for the videos. If you can help out financially, either with a super thanks, or if you can help out over at patreon.com/industrialrevolution, that'll help me to extend my range even further, get out to more and better sites, and bring you even better videos. Thanks for watching. Look forward to seeing you next time.